So, anti-Semitism is coursing the globe in a variety of different forms and streams with different emotional effects and different cognitive content. And it's hard to grapple with it. It's hard to get a handle on what exactly it is. And I want to start by just giving you a few highlights, lowlights, tidbits, call them what you will. The notion that Jews have too much power in business or finance is something you've all heard. It's one of the most common tropes of anti-Semitism historically and today. It's neither something that is solely a province of the so-called new anti-Semitism, a term which I don't really like, or the old anti-Semitism. It's both. We hear it, you say, okay, I've heard it before. You might know the survey data. 40% of Europeans subscribe to this notion. 250 million Europeans think that this is true. It's unbelievable. And you hear it and you say, okay, and you don't stop, or maybe you do, but most people don't stop to think, what does that really mean, the simple statement? What is behind such a statement? Jews have too much power in business. First, why are Jewish businessmen and businesswomen seen as Jews? What are they doing in business that make them Jews or that make their Jewishness relevant other than what other businessmen and businesswomen are doing, which is making things and selling things and making profit and so on and so forth? I dare anyone to show, and no one ever has, that Jewish businessmen and businesswomen systematically conduct themselves in some way different from non-Jewish businessmen and businesswomen and do so in some underhanded way. And yet that is what is behind such a statement. The identification of a person's attribute that has no relevance to what the issue is at hand is a hallmark of prejudice, in this case anti-Semitism. So when you hear people talking about Jewish businessmen or Jewish businesswomen, unless they're wearing skull caps, unless they're praying at work, unless they're doing something for which this is directly relevant, it in itself is a sign of prejudice. It's called essentializing. Okay, so why are they talked about as Jewish businessmen and businesswomen? Because of anti-Semitism. But what more are they saying when they say Jewish businessmen or Jews have too much power in business and finance? Well, power is something that people use for ends. And so the question is, what kinds of ends do people think Jews in business are using their alleged too much power for? What are they seeking to do? And if you say they have too much power, you think it's excessive, and obviously you think that they're doing something bad with this excessive power that they supposedly have. Well, what is that? Nobody seems to know. They used to say, they don't today, but nobody really seems to know. But the statement that Jews have too much power in business is built upon this underlying notion about Jews that somehow they're too powerful and that they're doing something bad with that power to threaten the non-Jews or the non-Jewish communities in which they live and move. So within this simple statement, Jews have too much power in business, contains, or the simple statement is a stand-in or is built upon a whole matrix of notions about Jews, that their Jewish identity is always relevant, even when it's not. That they have too much power, whatever that means. I should point out that Jews in Europe form less than 1% of virtually every European country, of all European countries. In some European countries, they're but a tiny percentage of the population, a tiny percentage of the business people. In Switzerland, there's something like 0.1% of the population. And yet 40 or 50%, I don't remember the number, of Swiss say Jews have too much power in business. In a community where the Swiss, that is, the non-Jewish Swiss business people, are not known for high-minded rectitude at all times. So what are they imagining? And which leads us to another aspect of what this simple statement reveals. The fantastical powers that non-Jews, anti-Semites have attributed to Jews. That this tiny percentage of Swiss business people who are Jewish, who happen to be Jewish, are somehow too powerful in this rather stable and secure and wealthy and powerful country with its powerful business community. What does this tell us, this simple statement about all that is believed about Jews in this world? We pass it over too easily. Just as we pass over too easily when we hear, oh, only 10% of the people in this country are anti-Semitic. Great, only 10%. Well, my God, why is anybody anti-Semitic? Why should the number be above 0? Why should we think that that's a great success? It may be if it used to be 20 or 30%. What we need to do is to learn to see anti-Semitism anew. We've become so inured to it, even those of us who study it, those of us who professionally engage with it. We've become too inured to its existence and its workings that we don't see it for what it is anymore. If we move from this simple statement to some other statements that some of you may be familiar with. In the Arab and Islamic world, Jews are routinely said to be the children of apes and pigs. A dehumanizing notion. It's a notion that says these people are not really human beings. This is not a new source of anti-Semitism, but it's an ancient source of anti-Semitism and a powerful one. It comes from the Quran and the Quranic tradition. It is intoned frequently, indeed incessantly, in Arab and Islamic worlds, including and especially in mosques, and including and especially during the Friday sermons, and is broadcast on television throughout country after country and in international channels. It is one of the most defaming, demeaning, and dangerous notions, anti-Semitic notions of all time. And yet it is, if not the most common, then one of the most common anti-Semitic tropes in the Arab world. Where, by the way, and I'll say more to this, unlike in the West, where people are reluctant to say things openly about Jews, using the term Jews, in the Arab and Islamic world, they are quite open about what they're talking about, and they're talking quite frequently, explicitly and openly about Jews, and that is their preferred term, and I'll get back to this. During the run-up to the Iraq War, and since then, it was frequently said, and said by some important people, that a Jewish cabal is running or duping the British and American governments to get them to go into the Iraq War. Now, this is not a form of dehumanization. After all, they weren't saying that Jews are not human beings, but it's a form of a demonization. And these two concepts are often collapsed, and they shouldn't be. They're different. They're saying that Jews of each country were demonic in essence, not maybe literally, but demonic in their doings, in getting the governments of each country, duping them or influencing them to go to war against the interests of their countries, of their fellow citizens, and thereby producing the unneeded and criminal deaths of members of their own societies. This is a terrible form of demonization in the United States and in Britain. If we go from the first world to the third world, you find horrifying statistics. You find them in the first world also, as it used to be called, I guess. In Brazil, 40% of the people are anti-Semitic. In Kenya, 50% of the people are anti-Semitic. In China, 40% of the people are anti-Semitic. And these are in countries where there are effectively no Jews. In China, there are, no Jews, a few hundred. In Kenya, there are no Jews. In Brazil, Jews form 0.05% of the population. And yet, a huge number of people are anti-Semitic. They say yes to explicit anti-Semitic statements. They say they believe them. What is going on here? That you have a prejudice. There is no other example of such a prejudice that courses around the world where there are no people against whom that prejudice is targeting. What does it say? That vast numbers of people in these countries hold this prejudice against Jews. And the question, of course, is why do they do so, and ultimately, what are the effects? Back to Europe. Jews are actually fleeing the continent. They're leaving. They're leaving to go to Israel, go to the United States, to go wherever they can go, which is safe, Israel or the United States, Canada to some extent. And they're leaving, even those who are staying physically are leaving in that they're hiding and bunkering themselves. Their institutions are like fortresses, round-the-clock police protection. They hide their identities. They don't walk on the streets showing signs of wearing symbols of their Jewishness, kippot, Stars of David, what have you. And they don't do it because they know that if they do it, or particularly if their children do it, they're worried about their children, that sooner or later there is a high probability that they will be physically assaulted. The Jews of Europe are fleeing, either leaving the countries or fleeing within, and there are many people who believe, and I am one of them, that there is, under the current trajectory, no future for the Jews of Europe. And that in 20 or 40 or 50 years, there will be but really rump groups of Jews left in the European countries, if any at all. And then if we go to the center of Jewish political life, which has been discussed here, Israel. Israel is faced by something that no other country is faced by, and it should be conceptualized this way: an international eliminationist, or on the part of many, an international eliminationist or genocidal coalition. There's a coalition of countries and institutions, and of course with vast numbers of supporters and followers, that are coalescing around the notion that Israel must be destroyed one way or another. Some would have notions that somehow the Jews will all leave and go somewhere else, or become second-class citizens in their own country, but it won't be their country anymore. And many others want to destroy the Jews there physically in toto. This is quite unusual. Now, as horrifying, and I think it is, as this quick little staccato survey of a few facets of anti-Semitism is today, what it doesn't convey to you is what the tenor, the content, the emotions, the passions of anti-Semitism, what they are like. And to give you a sense of it, let me read you something. And this is about Jews. It becomes clear later in the passage, but I'll just say it up front. Intoxicated mentally by the messianic dream of a greater Israel, which will finally achieve the expansionist dreams of the most radical Zionism, contaminated by the monstrous and rooted certitude. This is a reference to the old, long-standing Christian anti-Semitic notions that Jews are stiff-necked in their certitude of their rightness and won't see the wisdom of converting and so on. Contaminated by the monstrous and rooted certitude that in this catastrophic and absurd world there exists a people chosen by God, and that consequently all the actions of an obsessive, psychologically and pathologically exclusivist racism are justified. Educated and trained in the idea that any suffering that has been inflicted or is being inflicted or will be inflicted on everyone else, especially the Palestinians, will always be inferior to that which they themselves suffered in the Holocaust. The Jews endlessly scratch their own wound to keep it bleeding. Think of that image. They keep their wound bleeding on purpose, to make it incurable, and they show it to the world as if it were a banner. Israel seizes hold of the terrible words of God in Deuteronomy. Vengeance is mine, and I will be repaid. Classic anti-Semitic trope. Israel wants all of us to feel guilty, directly and indirectly, for the horrors of the Holocaust. Israel wants us to renounce the most elemental critical judgment, and for us to transform ourselves into a docile echo of its will. It wants to enslave us, is what the author is saying. Israel, in short, is a racist state by virtue of Judaism's monstrous doctrines. Note, Judaism's doctrines, not Israel's doings, not some Jewish political notion, but Judaism's monstrous doctrines. Israel, in short, is a racist state by virtue of Judaism's monstrous doctrines, racist not just against the Palestinians, but against the entire world, which it seeks to manipulate and abuse. Israel's struggles with its neighbors, seen in that light, do take on a unique and even metaphysical quality of genuine evil. The quality that distinguishes Israel's struggle from those of all other nations with disputed borders, no matter what the statistics of death and suffering might suggest. Now, if I told you that these were the words and from an article of a Hamas or Hezbollah leader, you would all say, not a big surprise. But it didn't come from them. It came, the words appeared in El País, Spain's paper of record, or one of its major newspapers, in 2002, and it was published by Jose Saramago, the Nobel Prize-winning author. Imagine a Nobel Prize-winning author, Portuguese, saying anything like this about any other group. would any paper in Europe, any legitimate paper like El País, publish it? The question answers itself. Yet they published it. They published the next day a couple of rebuttals, but big deal. The damage was done. And whatever the hyperbolic language here, most European elites would hear this and say, well, he may go overboard, but he's essentially correct. He expresses the view of the European elites with this statement. Not all of them, but by and large. The one thing that he didn't do, if you notice, with all of his demonization of Jews and Israel and Judaism's monstrous doctrines, and all of the malevolence he attributes to them, and all of the cruelty he says that they have on their ledger, he doesn't actually say what should be done about this. He pulls up short. Because what is the logic of such a statement, of such a characterization of a people? What is the logic? Tell them to be nicer? So he doesn't say anything. To find out what the logical conclusion of such a view of Jews and Judaism in Israel is, you have to go to the Arab and Islamic world where you find it said quite openly. After the 2006 election, Hamas's leader, Mashal, affirmed that they had an unalterable plan to destroy Israel. He did this in a chilling address at a Friday sermon in a Damascus mosque that was aired by Al Jazeera throughout the Arab world. So this is taking place in a mosque, a religious institution. It's aired throughout the Arab world on television. And he lays out his Hamas's fanatical political vision to conquer and slay its enemies. After his speech moved his audience of religious worshipers to interrupt him with the chant, "Death to Israel, death to Israel, death to America." Again, this is taking place in a mosque. Mashal lapsed into blood-curdling reverie. These were his words. "Before Israel dies, it must be humiliated and degraded. Allah willing, before they die, they will experience humiliation and degradation every day. Allah willing, we will make them lose their eyesight. We will make them lose their brains." Think of this imagery. This is the leader of a political movement putting forward such graphic, gruesome imagery. We want them to suffer. We want to torture them, and they should suffer the pain of torture and lose their eyesight and their brains before we kill them. It's not just from Mashal. It's from many others. Shortly after, Hamas's website began to carry 2 Hamas genocide bombers' video testaments, which included the message of one, "My message to the loathed Jews," notice that he says Jews, not Israelis, not Zionists, but Jews, "is that there is no God but Allah. We will chase you everywhere, around the world, everywhere. We are a nation that drinks blood, and we know that there is no blood better than the blood of Jews. We will not leave you alone until we have quenched our thirst with your blood and our children's thirst with your blood." From the high leader Mashal to the lowly suicide bomber, the same kind of gruesome, bloodthirsty imagery that speaks for itself. Now, I've pointed out that they speak of Jews, and not so much these days of Israelis and Zionists. They used to speak a lot about the Zionist entity and so on, but that's a bit passé. And we get an explanation for this from another leader in the Arab and anti-Israel movement, Hassan Nasrallah, who after the war in Lebanon was the rock star of the Arab world for Hezbollah's holding out against the Israelis as much as they did. The term the Zionist entity has not been a sufficiently deprecatory term for him for the political collectivity of Jews. And he and Hezbollah have taken to using the term the Jewish entity instead. Because Jewish is considered by Hezbollah such a vile term, and the epithet Zionism or Zionist is not strong enough. Why this happens makes more sense when we hear Nasrallah's explanation, which in 1997 he explained to an interviewer that it is not Israel and Israelis whom he most fundamentally hates, but Jews themselves. And he said, if we search the entire world for a person more cowardly, despicable, weak and feeble in psyche, mind, ideology, and religion, notice all of these, psyche, mind, ideology, religion, we would not find anyone like the Jew. Notice I do not say the Israeli. It's about Jews, and it's always been about Jews. And even though it is much focus on the Jews who live in Israel, or the Israelis as they are often called in a shorthand. Now I've given you these nuggets, these facts about anti-Semitism, and the words of some anti-Semites to give you a sense of it, but they're just nuggets. They don't begin to convey what is going on in the world out there. I open with them because people aren't aware of the extent and character of anti-Semitism, even a lot of people who pay attention. I do it for another reason, because people, and this has been alluded to here, have their heads in the sand. And in fact, we live in the United States where there is less anti-Semitism and less open anti-Semitism than just about anywhere in the world. And so it is a problem of trying to get people to understand that their experience here is so exceptional, not somewhat exceptional, but so exceptional to what exists in almost everywhere in the world, not everywhere in the world, but almost everywhere in the world. It's important to say that people deny that there is anti-Semitism, so just to get people to recognize that there is, you've got to spend a lot of time laying out what is out there. They deny it. They say there's not really anti-Semitism in a whole variety of ways. And they attack the people who talk about it. Anyone who talks about it, not just on campuses, but in general, in media, in front of audiences, can and will get attacked for it, and quite vociferously. It's not very pleasant, so many people don't. And of course, it's important to say these things, and I'll get back to this, because people want to blame it all on Israel, and that is intellectually dishonest and factually wrong and in a totally untenable position. And anybody who says that is either lying or doesn't know what he or she is talking about. Those are really the only two choices. So what do we want to know? If we want to try to understand anti-Semitism, what do we want to know? We want to know what it is. And people have bandied about various quick definitions of it here today. We want to know why it exists or what causes it. Another long topic of discussion. We want to know how it functions. I'm just laying this out because to show to you how complex it is and how much we need to time we need to spend on this to begin to get a handle on it. We want to know how it functions. How does it function in the lives of individuals, emotionally, psychologically, in their worldview, in small groups, in communities, in institutions, in countries, politically, and so on? How does it function? How has it been transformed historically and especially into its form today? Because that is a big and important topic that a lot of people are groping with. And then, what is its form today? These are all topics, each worthy of a long, long discussion. And I'm going to focus really on what it looks like today, though I'll say a few words about the others. But even before that, I have lots of preambles. I want to point out some difficulties, in addition to people not wanting to talk about it, people attacking those who do, people having their heads in the sand. I want to point out some difficulties. There are genuine confusions about anti-Semitism, as there are about prejudice, as there is about most complex social and political phenomena or cultural phenomena in the world. There are genuine confusions. Let me give you two and relate them to each other. The old explanation for anti-Semitism. I wrote my first book on the study on the perpetrators of the Holocaust. I'm well familiar with it. I've heard it a figurative 1,000 million times. Anti-Semitism is caused by economics. Either during times of economic calamity or stress, people look for scapegoats and therefore they find Jews, or because Jews have done so well economically. It's not true everywhere, of course, but they've done so well economically, there's a lot of jealousy. So it's all economics. I've heard this a thousand times. You don't hear that today anymore. Not much. It's all about Israel today. Israel is the cause of anti-Semitism. And we've already gone into this. Now, since anti-Semitism really is continuous, and many of the anti-Semitic prejudices that exist today existed in the 1930s and 20s and so on, it really doesn't make sense to say that it was all economics in the 20s and it's all Israel today, and you have pretty much the same prejudice. In fact, neither of them is true, and certainly both of them can't be true. And yet both are trotted, each is trotted. You can really talk to somebody about the Holocaust, oh, it's all economics. You talk about what's going on today, it's all Israel. The person can say it in consecutive sentences and not even realize how foolish he or she sounds. But there are genuine confusions. People are confused. It's hard to understand this. There are complexities. What's anti-Semitism? Simply, when people hate Jews, it's pretty simple. But it's a lot more complicated than that. Or prejudices against Jews. Simple. Anti-Semitism are lots of different things. They're people's beliefs, they're people's emotions. People have emotions, antipathies towards Jews that are not even very well grounded in articulated notions. It's part of anti-Semitism. It's speech. If I say Jews are X, Y, or Z, that's anti-Semitism. It doesn't much matter what I believe in my heart or whatever. Speech is anti-Semitism. Speech is, in fact, the way, speech and words and language is the way anti-Semitism is spread. It's acts, anti-Semitic acts, it's policies, it's programs. My position, and one can take different positions on this, though I was tempted to say one can reasonably take different positions, but I'm not really so sure I believe it, but I'll say it for the sake of sounding a little pluralistic on this point. If you are engaged in an anti-Semitic movement, take the BDS. If you march in anti-Semitic rallies, if you subscribe to anti-Semitic programs, it doesn't matter if you don't hate Jews. It matters on some level, but not for what you're doing and not for what you are. It doesn't matter if you don't hate Jews, and it doesn't matter if you say, but I don't believe they killed Jesus. You are an anti-Semite. Or at the very least, you're engaged in anti-Semitism, and what you're doing is anti-Semitic. Take an easy example. Someone joins the Nazi Party and carries out Hitler's orders and does so willingly, even says, I had friends who were Jews, I never hated them, I just did it because it doesn't matter. That's anti-Semitism. Somehow people think that for someone to be considered anti-Semite, that he has to scream, he has to be hitting a Jew and screaming, I'm doing this because I hate you because you killed Jesus. And if you don't meet all the criteria, you're not an anti-Semite. No, if you're hitting a Jew because the person is a Jew, that's enough. Anti-Semitism includes, and principally includes, the anti-Semitic acts that people undertake. It's not just hatred or passions or emotions. But it's complex. And how to make sense of it all is not easy. Anti-Semitism, these are among the difficulties we have in analyzing it. They have commonalities with other prejudices. It's not as if it's utterly singular, but there are singular qualities to it. And so we need to analyze it comparatively, and we need to identify the singular or unusual qualities of anti-Semitism. And you need to do both at the same time if you want to understand its functioning and its particular nature. And if we look at the singular qualities among them, and I'll just run over them quickly, it is the longest standing prejudice known of, certainly of any size and power and reach, known to human beings, with the exception of misogyny, and if you want to put it in the same category. But it's the longest standing ethnic or racist prejudice, or racial prejudice. It has a tenacity that is pretty much unparalleled. It holds on, transforms itself. Think of how tenacious it's been. Through all the eras, all the historical developments, all the technological developments, all the cultural changes, all the political regimes that have come and gone, all the different kinds of ways in which the world and institutions have been organized, it holds on despite all those changes. It's tenacious beyond belief. And one of the things it does, and I'll get back to this, is it metamorphoses itself like no other prejudice, taking on the idiom of its day. And when you understand what its core is, you can understand why it can do that so easily, and I'll get to that in a moment. It is unusual, if not singular, in the history of prejudice in that it exists where there are no people of the kind being described. Anti-Semitism has thrived historically where there are no Jews and thrives today where there are no Jews. Think of it. There may be prejudice against, name your ethnic group in some country, in that country, but go halfway around the world and say, oh, what do you think about, ask in Brazil, what do you think about Turks or Kurds, either one? Is there prejudice against Turks or Kurds in Brazil, in Argentina, in Japan, in this country, in that country? It's really quite unusual. It's taken on fantastical proportions. In the Middle Ages, Jews were likened, indeed identified with the devil, either being seen as his minions or being seen as devils themselves. I mean, just think. They looked at Jews and thought, this is a servant of the devil or a devil. This was axiomatic in Christian Europe. And in modern times, particularly in Germany and during the Nazi period, they looked at Jews as devils in human form, secular devils in human form, and would look upon a Jew and see someone who is not really a human being. This has nothing to do with reality. All prejudices distort reality. That's why we call them prejudices. They all exaggerate or make things up about the people they're describing, but rarely do the distortions and the fabrications rise to these fantastical and absurd levels. It's international. I've already hinted at that. Anti-Semitism has existed in country after country and around the world, and indeed has an international life, making it quite unusual. There's no other ethnic prejudice that you can think of like this. There is a bloodlust that goes with it. Fantasies of killing Jews and the acts of killing Jews have accompanied the words and deeds of anti-Semites for centuries upon centuries. And today it is so open and so widespread. The call for Jewish blood, you've heard some of it, it is as commonplace as anything that you can hear in the public sphere in many parts of the world. And finally, it is eliminationist, a general term that I use that includes exterminationist, the desire to eliminate Jews, to get rid of them somehow, whether by ghettoization, expulsion, or by killing them, has been a common property, not always, but a common property of anti-Semitism. So why do we have all these qualities, longevity, tenacity, and fantastical nature, and so on? Why do we have them, and why do we have such a broad spread and the transformation of anti-Semitism through the ages? And we have it because anti-Semitism is built upon a foundational paradigm which, if you understand, unlocks the key to its historical existence and even to what's going on today. Whatever the higher level elaborations of anti-Semitism, whatever the specific accusations that have been leveled at Jews, they've all been built upon the paradigm, which has the following elements: that Jews are fundamentally different from non-Jews. The difference can be seen to reside in their religion, to reside in their race or their genes, or to reside in their malevolent politics, which is what we have today, by and large. But they're fundamentally different. They're not just a little bit different. There is a qualitatively different quality to them, qualitatively different aspect to them. Second, that they are noxious. That they're noxious in some profound way. Third, that they willfully do harm. It's not just that many people don't like people who aren't of their group, and they don't like their ways, they don't like the foods they eat, whatever, but they don't always, and indeed quite often, most of the time they don't see them as being willfully doing harm, as being willfully malevolent. Jews are powerful as the fourth element, and therefore Jews are dangerous. This is the core of the anti-Semitic paradigm that has existed in every kind of anti-Semitism. And why it's so easy when old forms of anti-Semitism no longer become plausible, when in a secular age Christian forms become less plausible to people, it's easy to adopt new anti-Semitic tropes, new accusations, because if you believe this about Jews, then you can believe just about anything about them that ascribes to them ill will and evil capacities. When you get this paradigm, if you understand, you can rethink anti-Semitism through the ages and think about it, if you can, when I start going through the contemporary scene, which I'll do right now. There have been basically three eras of anti-Semitism: the Christian anti-Semitism, the modern racist anti-Semitism, and now the third kind, which can be called global anti-Semitism. I don't like the term the new anti-Semitism. It's too much of a break. There are fundamental differences, and new doesn't really tell us what its nature is. Religious anti-Semitism or Christian anti-Semitism captures the essence of it. It was grounded in Christian demonization of Jews, coming out of the conflict over the inheritance of the Jewish tradition, and elaborated and indeed even sanctified in word and institutionally by Christian writers and leaders. Then we had racist anti-Semitism, which also made sense. It was grounded in race, social Darwinian notions, a modern, so-called modern understanding. We now live in a global era, and we have an appropriately named and sadly an appropriately formed anti-Semitism that mirrors it. So global anti-Semitism, what are its features? Many streams of anti-Semitism come together. There's been Christian anti-Semitism, there's been Muslim anti-Semitism through the ages. There's been leftist, there's been rightist anti-Semitism. There's been various kinds of anti-Semitism. What is so interesting, or not interesting, what is notable about them historically is that they've been relatively distinct from one another, relatively separate from one another. There's been cross-fertilization, but they've had their own sources, and they've stayed within their own streams of anti-Semitism. Today, they're all brought together. If you go back and read that passage by Saramago, the Nobel Prize-winning author, you'll find all the streams of anti-Semitism in there. There's a mishmash. They're brought together. There's a cross-fertilization that is in keeping with the character of global flows and the globalization of culture in our time. You have leftists and Muslims walking hand in hand, marching hand in hand against Israel when we know that, or including lesbians and gays and Marxists walking side by side in marches against Israel, when we know what, in their hearts of hearts, what some of the political Muslims would want to do to the leftists and to the lesbians and gays if they could, or what would be done in the countries that they claim to represent to these people. You have Islamic and Christian forms of anti-Semitism coming together. One of the most common tropes, surprisingly little known, even though it is so common, and it's given visual form in cartoons on a regular basis, is to present Palestinians or Palestine as the new Jesus on the cross. This is incredibly common in the Arab and Islamic world, where there are cartoons with a person on the cross, and it says Palestine on him on the cartoon, or Palestinians, and it's elaborated in various ways. This appeals, of course, to many Christians who harbor anti-Semitic notions, and also to Christian institutions, and it is used quite self-consciously on the part of Muslim institutions, leaders, and countries to try to win over converts to their cause. So you have this very strange confluence here that would have been historically not predictable, but which has come about. So anti-Semitism is global in that it has brought together the various streams of anti-Semitism into one amalgam. What appears in one stream will appear shortly thereafter in another stream. There's a lot of cross-fertilization. The numbers are global. In Europe, there are more than 250 million anti-Semites. I won't go over the survey data in any detail here. The numbers are simply horrifying. You get these numbers if you take the percentage of people who say yes to anti-Semitic questions and you just multiply by the number of people. You take a percentage of the number of people in Europe. In Asia, Africa, and Latin America, there are certainly more than 1 billion anti-Semites. In the Arab and Islamic worlds, there are hundreds of millions. The numbers are just horrifying. And I will say one word about the surveys. The ADL does surveys, does a good job in doing surveys and getting numbers, but they have unbelievably stringent criteria for deeming someone an anti-Semite. In their largest survey, the ADL Global 100, which was done in 2013-14, they asked 10 anti-Semitic questions, and they asked whether you agreed with 10 anti-Semitic notions, and to be deemed an anti-Semite, you had to say yes to 6 of them. It wasn't enough to say yes to 5 of them, or to 3 of them, or even to 1 of them. Let me tell you what one of them was. Imagine deeming this person not an anti-Semite. Jews are responsible for most of the wars of the world. If you say yes to that, but not to 5 other things, you're not an anti-Semite. Now let's just return, one of the things we have to do in dealing with anti-Semitism is not see it for what it is, not only that, but also restore a phrase I'm not crazy about because it's a little overused, common sense, or rather the conventional notions of evaluation we use for other prejudices. If someone says blacks are lazy, what do we say about that person? We say he's a racist. And we say it for good reason. All it takes is one prejudicial statement in this country about an ethnic minority, and you say that person is a racist or a bigot or what have you. But the ADL says you've got to say 6 of them, and they're a lot worse than saying, I'm not saying blacks are lazy isn't bad, but they're a lot worse than saying blacks are lazy. And so they grossly understate how much anti-Semitism there is around the world. They concluded there's 1.1 billion people who meet this criteria. That's unbelievable. Do you know how many Jews there are in the world? 13 million. There are very few Jews in any but a handful of countries. They also, by the way, in the ADL survey, did not ask about any classically anti-Semitic religious notions, either about Jesus or Muhammad. Why they didn't, you have to ask them. But if they had asked those questions, they certainly would have gotten enormously higher numbers of anti-Semites. Okay. The numbers are horrifying, catastrophic. These are people who are deeply, deeply prejudiced against Jews. Many streams come together, enormous numbers, they're global, and it's important to say up front, it's not caused by Israel. And it is easy to show. It's not just something we can talk about and say, well, you just listen and whatever. You can see the animus. That's all true. I'm not denying that. You can see it in the numbers. The data are unequivocal. It's not caused by Israel. Classical anti-Semitic prejudices have nothing to do with Israel. So let's look at the classical prejudices. Jews have too much influence in business. I already told you, 40% of the Europeans say yes to that, 250 million people. Jews have too much power, 190 million Europeans. What do either of those have to do with Israel? Jews have too much power in business. Nothing. Predates Israel. And if Israel ever should cease to exist, it will post-date Israel too. Jews have too much influence in international financial markets, 255 million people in the EU. The Jews care about only their own kind, 200 million people in the EU. Jews guilty for the death of Jesus, 100 million in Europe. Think of that. Still 100 million people believe this age-old, in Europe, worst prejudicial canard of any kind of all time. They're responsible for the death of God or the Son of God. And you should note how significant that number is, because Europe is an unbelievably secular region, where very large numbers, certainly in the western and northern part of Europe, of Europeans are secular. So to get 100 million people who believe this means a very large percentage of religious belief, of the religiously devout still hold this notion. It's very powerful. Now, very significant and not paid attention to. In 2009, the ADL asked a survey question, which was a one-timer, which is, are Jews responsible for the global financial crisis that had occurred? And 150 million people in the EU said yes. Now, the reason this is so significant, of course, has nothing to do with Israel. That's not the reason it's so significant. The reason it's so significant is this was the single most focused on, reported on, well reported on event of the year, perhaps of the entire decade. Everybody had lots of information. People contested exactly what happened, but mortgage-backed securities in this country, sovereign bank debt in Europe and so on, and they knew about it. Everybody was getting the reports, and there was nothing in the media about Jews. And yet, so many people said it's the Jews who did it. It shows how fantastical, hallucinatory, how deeply bigoted the European populace is. Of people who have multiple interlocking anti-Semitic views in Europe, there are 170 million people. Finally, if we get to Israel, on the one, Jews are responsible for most of the world's war, 80 million people in Europe say yes. Then another question, which does have something to do with Israel, but goes to the issue of how fantastical anti-Semitism is. Israel is conducting a war of extermination against the Palestinian people. Now, whatever you think about the Middle East conflict, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it is not reasonable to say that they're conducting a war of extermination, that is, Israelis or Jewish Israelis against Palestinians. In other words, it is not reasonable to say they are perpetrating a genocide. When asked, 55% of the people in the European Union say yes to this. 275 million people. 57% in Germany say yes to this, 45 million people. Not just in Europe, but also in Europe, but especially in Germany, they know what this means. They're actually saying that Israel is committing a genocide against the Palestinians. Now, one of the things one shouldn't spend a lot of time on in dealing with anti-Semitism is trying to refute it chapter and verse, because it's a hopeless cause, because the deep prejudices are an inoculation on the part of the people against learning that what they're believing is wrong. But I'll at least give you a couple pieces of information on this war of extermination. From 1990 to 2008, the Palestinian population in the occupied territories doubled. It had one of the highest growth rates in the world from 1998 to 2008. Hardly a war of extermination. Up until a couple of years ago, in the previous 10 years, the Israelis killed 6,500 Palestinians in the various conflicts that have taken place, and Palestinians killed about 1,000 Israelis. A lot of people, 6,500 people is a lot of people, 1,000 Israelis is a lot of people. Hardly a war of extermination. It's totally fantastical. It's totally prejudiced and anti-Semitism. The Arab and Islamic Quranic tradition that holds Jews to be the children of apes and pigs, or to be apes and pigs, that they poison the prophets and they kill the prophets and try to poison Muhammad. This has nothing to do with Israel. This is age-old anti-Semitism. And finally, another obvious point that simply is not brought out and that needs to be intoned again and again, this rise of anti-Semitism, global anti-Semitism, which can be dated to about 1990, when things really began to take off, and for complex reasons perhaps, coincided with the most hopeful period in Palestinian-Israeli relations. The 1990s, the Oslo period, which is when there was the most hope, and the hope on large parts of governments, political leaders, and publics around the world that there would be an agreement. This is when anti-Semitism made its huge resurgence, or began its huge resurgence. Why, if this had something to do with Israel, would it be occurring then? It has nothing to do with Israel. And finally, some more data about Israel, about how this is not an Israeli-driven thing. We have survey data from 2008 and 2009, right before and after Operation Cast Lead, the war in Lebanon. And what we see in that data, and this is another important point, when conjoined with the data for attacks in Europe, where we have a lot of data, the politics in the Middle East correlate with anti-Semitic attacks. So when there's a big conflict in the Middle East, physical attacks on Jews and institutions go up in Europe. And when things die down, go back to the simmering status quo, attacks die down. This may be changing in the last year or so, but we'll leave that aside. So you see these spikes, and so people say, aha, see, Israel in its actions by provoking or causing or undertaking these conflicts is producing anti-Semitism. That's not correct. And it confuses anti-Semitic actions, explicit attacks, with the underlying phenomenon, which is the prejudice, the hatred, the beliefs, and so on. What the survey data shows is that right before Operation Cast Lead and right afterwards, that there was no move of the needle of anti-Semitism in European country after European country. It went up 1 percentage point in Poland, down a point in Germany. I'm just saying numbers. These aren't the actual numbers. It didn't budge. The underlying anti-Semitism was not affected by the war, which was the single most condemned operation, I think it's fair to say, of Israel of the last 20 years. So yes, it led to a spike in attacks, But anti-Semitic expression, just as prejudicial expression in this country, is not a guide to how much anti-Semitism there is in general or how much prejudice there is in this country. Think of how much prejudice there is in this country and how rarely you walk down this, how rarely in the public sphere you hear someone making a prejudicial statement that is at least prior to the recent election campaign. But on the part of ordinary people at work, how often at work do you hear people say racist things? Do you really think there's as little racism as you hear at work? So it is not caused by Israel, but, and here's the big but its focus is Israel. And its focus is Israel for a lot of reasons, one of which is in the West, not in the Arab and Islamic world, but in the West, it is totally, almost totally taboo to make anti-Semitic charges against Jews of the kind that have been historically the norm. Who today says that Jews are responsible for wrecking the economy of Germany, of France, of Britain? Who today says that Jews are corrupting the culture of the country? Who today says these kinds of things, which were the common notions of anti-Semitism for hundreds of years and certainly well into the 20th century? Many people believe some of these things, that Jews have too much power in business, but they don't say it in public. But what they can say and where they can focus their attention and their fire is on Israel. Because Israel, as the political instantiation, of Jewish collective life, because that's what it is. Whatever we think about the wonderful pluralism of the United States and Jews' full membership in this country and in the political life of some other countries, it is Israel which is the fullest expression of Jewish political life. What better way to express your hatred of a people than to attack its political core and the country which is its own? Anti-Israelism is by definition of anti-Semitism. A lot has been said here. It includes the demonization of Israel. Be critical, yes. Demonize, no. If you demonize, you're an anti-Semite. To hold Israel to be the most dangerous country in the world, or the greatest threat to world peace, which most Europeans have held it to be, runs neck and neck with the United States, is again fantastical. The world is blowing up, and Israel is considered the greatest threat to world peace. That is anti-Semitism. If you delegitimize the state, if you deny its features that the people who live there have a right to live there or have a history there, that Judaism was founded, that Judaism had its original life and a good part of its existence there, that there was a temple in the Temple Mount, the Temple of Solomon, that the Holocaust occurred. There's a whole list in my book, The Devil That Never Dies, of all the forms of denialism that exist among anti-Semites, and not just in the Arab world, but also in Western movements. It's a stunning list, and when you look at the list, one of the things that is striking is you'd be hard-pressed to think of any other country or people against whom you would find even one of these, let alone the 10 or so that exist in powerful form around the world. If you deny Israel's existence, or the right of Israel to exist, or the Jews to have a country of their own, just as the French have a country of their own, even if not all people in France are French, in every sense of the term, whatever that means, just as not all people in Israel are Jews, but all are citizens. If you deny that, you're an anti-Semite. And if you treat Israel as a devil among nations, you are an anti-Semite. And that's what they do. Now, global anti-Semitism is not caused by Israel. It's focused on Israel, and I'll just wrap up here with some of its other essential features. Anti-Semitism, and this is one of the things that makes it really radically different from what came before, though it has always had a domestic and international component. You hated or feared the Jews in your town or neighborhood or in the next town or in your region in medieval times and modern times, but you also worried about international Jewry, the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Historically, the balance has always been towards the domestic. You worried more about the local Jews, even if there was an international dimension. And with global anti-Semitism, it's flipped. The focus is almost entirely on international Jews, that is, Jews in the United States on the part of the rest of the world, pulling the strings, the levers of power, distorting of the American colossus, and of course the Jews in Israel. You'd rarely hear attack. In Eastern Europe, there are growing exceptions to this, but you rarely hear attacks upon the Jews, domestic Jews of France, of Germany, of Britain, of the Netherlands, and so on, except perhaps as supporters of Israel, but not as Jews qua Jews. They're in fact taboo. And people don't really worry about them all that much, whatever their anti-Semitism. So it is internationally, it's global in its orientation instead of being domestically oriented. And finally, and this is critical, anti-Semitism today is political. Global anti-Semitism, we live in a global world where we understand everything is political. Politics touches everything, and so is anti-Semitism. When before it was mainly cultural in the form of religion, or seen to be social, that Jews were corroding society, today it's political. It is Jews and their political choices, American Jews and Jews in Israel, who are willfully, through their politics, doing things that is seen to be the reason that they are so nefarious. And it is met politically. You have an international eliminations coalition. You have, for the first time in history, a prejudice that is at the center of the foreign policy of many countries. There are many countries that have the spread of anti-Semitism at the center of their foreign policies. This has never happened before. And you have this international political anti-Semitic and eliminations coalition. The U.S., as you've heard, is an exception to this, to much, if not most of what I've said. It's another long story. There are reasons to be worried. But the sad, sad fact is anti-Semitism is back. It really is the devil that has never died.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.